The Division 2 is perhaps the clearest possible example of a sequel exclusively appealing to the fans of the original. Its biggest improvement over its predecessor, the dense post-level cap endgame content, will not entice anyone bored by the MMO-like grind hidden beneath the shooter trappings, nor will it be enough to distract those who find the Division's world ethically disquieting. If you can overlook or even embrace the game's flaws, the Division 2 has plenty of smart design choices to facilitate your loot shooting. Just be sure you know what you're getting into. First, make sure you set aside a lot of time. The Division 2 boasts a one-by-one recreation of several Washington, D.C. neighborhoods, with each boasting their own set of story missions, side missions, upgrade point caches, control points to capture, collectibles, and dynamic world events. It's a lot to take in every time you open the map, but to the game's credit, it does a fantastic job of making everything you do feel relevant. Random side activities feed into projects you can undertake for the game's major settlements, which reward the player with crafting blueprints, experience, and money. Completing projects and side missions is how you upgrade each settlement. Those upgrades recruit specialists for your base of operations in the White House, which unlocks base upgrades like a crafting bench or a bounty system where players can hunt high-value AI targets. Even though it took Mike around 30 hours to even so much as sniff the Division 2's endgame, he never felt like his time was being wasted. The problem with the loot treadmill that a lot of games employ is that progression is exclusively tied to what weapons you find and your character's level, so the only sense of forward momentum is locked behind grinding. But that isn't the case here. Settlements visually grow and improve as you continue to upgrade them, and the garbage loot you get from liberating control points is still worth keeping around because you can turn it into crafting materials or recalibrate your existing gear with the junk's perks. You're always moving forward no matter what you're doing. The real issue here is twofold. You need to be okay with the fact that the said progression ultimately manifests as little more than slightly higher numbers on your guide, and you need to actively enjoy the way the game plays. Sometimes that's a tall order. The shooting feels great, the guns feel satisfyingly impactful, and each skill has an appropriate time and place. Once you're uncovered in shooting, the game feels fantastic. It's everything else that's the problem. Getting your character to move from point A to point B without the use of the game's cover-to-cover mechanic is a real chore. Character movement seems to be designed with combat in mind. The player character more strafes than he does move around, which would be fine if spending literally any time out of cover was a viable strategy, but it's not. So trying to move around a battlefield before you get ventilated becomes deeply frustrating. Sprinting without the game's automatic parkour function practically nullifies sprinting in the first place, since you get caught up so easily on debris, but sprinting with automatic parkour on will regularly cause you to climb things you have no business climbing, simply because it's in your way. Of course, this being a realistic shooter, you will climb as gingerly and deliberately as possible. In any shooter where you will die very quickly, even if you hit the proper level requirement, movement needs to be as tight and precise as possible. And on a controller, it just isn't. Perhaps it's not the case on PC, but with years of third-person shooters out there, you would think this problem would have been solved by now. It's something you can absolutely get used to, as Mike did, but there's a learning curve there to be sure. That can be partially mitigated by having other players in your party, which we would highly recommend. Mike played a majority of the game by himself, only looking for outside help once the story mission started to surpass his character's level. Thankfully, the game makes it easy to find other players, with an ambient matchmaking system that queues you up for an activity to designate while you muck around in the open world. Most of the time you'll find somebody within seconds of searching, but it's still a nice feature nonetheless. The Division 2 has asinine dialogue, however. So bad, Mike would rather hear the unfiltered thoughts of random PSN users than even 1 second of the game. When a game's writing includes optional cutscenes where the bad guy executes a doctor and leaves civilians to die in a quarantine, that's usually a good sign you've stumbled across a podcast game. A game where the audio is replaced by whatever thing you've been meaning to catch up on, so you don't have to look at it. For example, the player character is a super cop with a license to kill and no oversight aside from one person, fully authorized and kitted out by the federal government. Have we truly run out of every colonialist fantasy possible? To the point where developers have to wrangle a settler bandit narrative out of major American cities? Hell, you're even referred to as the sheriff from time to time, represented on the protagonist's war room map by a Wild West figurine. If you find this game's story distasteful, especially considering the modern American political climate of misused government overreach, it's hard to blame you. Everything is political. It's just that many don't realize that things like the status quo or basic power fantasies fall into that category whether they like it or not. There are plenty of reasons to not like The Division 2. And that's without getting to the tome of small, if ultimately irrelevant complaints. Like a menu system that occasionally binds 2 different commands to the left trigger, making navigation literally impossible as intended. If you didn't wake up yesterday wanting to play a really strong loot shooter, there's really not much for you here. Especially if you can't overlook the unsettling political ramifications of being the judge, jury, and executioner in an ultra-violent Washington, D.C. The Division 2 gets a 5 out of 10.